Good evening and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know. We are online at commonwealthclub.org, on Facebook, Twitter, and check out our YouTube channel. I'm Alan Jones, Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, and your moderator for today's program. Krista Tippett is a journalist and author and recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship, a White House National Humanities Medal, and a Peabody for her public radio program On Being, formerly called Speaking of Faith. With her signature soothing voice, I didn't write this, but with her signature soothing voice, which I hope we will transcend tonight, Krista engages in conversation with scientists, poets, artists, activists, and theologians about values, philosophy, and the meaning of humanity in the modern age. A native of Shawnee, Oklahoma, Krista was born on the day John F. Kennedy was elected president. She's a graduate of Brown University and Yale Divinity School. She worked in Bonn, Germany, as a foreign correspondent and went on to become a special assistant to the U.S. ambassador to West Germany. And after working on a fascinating oral history project with the Benedictine monks of St. John's Abbey in Minnesota, she was inspired to host religious and spiritual conversations through radio, many of which are included in her books. So Krista is here today to talk about her career and ideas in her new book, already a New York Times bestseller, Becoming Wise, an Inquiry into the Mystery of the Art of Living. So welcome, Krista, to California.
Thank you.
I wanted to begin by saying not only how much I enjoyed your book, but one of these big cosmic questions is if you could give us a sort of 30-second State of the Union address with regard to the spiritual state of the world and of the country. Because that might open up some conversation.
I think I only need 10 seconds.
10 seconds,
no,
all right.
Just kidding. I think this is a moment of great confusion and peril and anxiety. And I also think it's a moment of abundance and possibility, generative possibility. I think we're all awake. I think there is a lot of soul searching that wasn't happening before. And my hope is that we continue to live into, to hold that space for searching ourselves, for staying awake, and for understanding that it's up to us, whoever we are, whatever we do, to create the realities we want to inhabit. And there's the reality and the story of our time that's in the New York Times today or the San Francisco Chronicle, but the whole story is much bigger than that.
I was struck. Let me read something that you wrote in the book. Here's what's new. A surfacing of grief. We don't know where to begin to change our relationship with the strangers who are our neighbors, to address the ways in which our well-being may well be oblivious to theirs or harming theirs. And so we return to the blunt instrument of the market, the reduction of everything to economics. Now that's the question. I mean, one could say it's reduced to anger, being angry, but this new surfacing of grief. Can you?
And I mean, I wrote that, that was published in April of 2016. I think it's important. I mean, everything has felt very dramatic these last few months, but we've been walking steadily towards this moment. And I mean, here's one. There are so many ways to come at this, but I feel like the election of Barack Obama as president was just this monumental, this magnificent accomplishment for a country with our history. And I think that and I know that was acknowledged by all kinds of people across the spectrum and by all kinds of people around the world. I think at one and the same time, it surfaced all the unfinished business we have to do to be worthy of that accomplishment, really, to carry that forward and live fully into it. And there's so many aspects of that, but that surfacing of grief, we've seen things about ourselves, and it didn't just start in November. It's hard. We're not necessarily taking them in. We don't necessarily know what to do.
What about the other side of that, the grief side, the anger side?
Yeah.
When you talk a lot about the importance of conversation, and a friend of mine translates the opening of the fourth gospel as "in the beginning was the conversation."
Yeah, and you told me that. I love that. Yeah.
And that conversation entered into our flesh, that no one has the last word, but we seem to be a culture where conversation is almost impossible.
Well, you can't really converse with anger, you know. You can't really talk but anger is always, almost always, anger is what pain and fear look like when they show themselves in public. And we actually we respond to anger. We validate it. I mean, and also I want to say anger is a moral response. Anger has its place in our midst. But we actually, in this country, don't know how to hold a space to dwell with human pain, raw human pain, or raw human fear. And therefore, what we end up dealing with each other at this level of anger, and that is very unproductive.
What would you say, though, about the religious state of the country and the world?
Well, you're really asking me the big questions.
You can understand why. I mean,
Yes.
I find that I am a religious person myself, but I'm totally flummoxed and embarrassed by the religiosity of this country, and so I need help.
All right.
And it's your job. And maybe to be fair, I mean, I'm teasing, but this whole question that you raise in terms of the title of your book about becoming wise, there's that distinction in the ancient tradition between scientia, knowledge, and sapientia, wisdom.
Yes.
And how we move from knowing stuff to having an inner wisdom, and that journey from scientism, if you like, to some kind of philosophy of life which has a deep wisdom to it, is a big journey for us.
It's interesting to be in San Francisco, to be near Silicon Valley, and we get so titillated by the idea of our machines becoming intelligent.
Oh.
And spinning all kinds of scenarios, and that's an interesting and I'm sure worthy thing to do. I think it would behoove us to get titillated by the possibilities for our intelligence, our consciousness that in fact we already possess, and our capacity not merely to become knowledgeable, but to become wise. And something that's become more important to me, since I wrote the book. I mean, it's in the book, but thinking of wisdom as work for common life and not just something that is merely personal.
I think that issue of a totally privatized reality and a kind of doctrine of the autonomous self with no reference to others is so maddening and isolating. No wonder we're depressed.
Yeah, it's an American pathology.
It is a pathology.
And it's not true to the reality of our species. We need each other.
You talk a lot about hospitality and generosity of spirit and how we cultivate that, and about being present to each other. What hits me, though, is that in order to do that, one needs something of a common culture. I'm not even talking about culture with a capital C, high culture, but In order for you and me to have a good row, we have to have some ground rules, even to disagree.
Yeah.
And there is that absence of culture in that sense. And where do you see some of the solutions, if there are any?
I guess I would challenge a little bit of our impulse to think that we have to have common ground, to perceive that common ground is a prerequisite for common life. I think we have to get a lot more humble about, maybe the only thing we have in common, at least that we can discern without knowing more, with people on the other side, whatever the other side is the fact that we're human beings. I think we have really essential grounding work to do in rehumanizing the way we think about and approach and speak about and speak to others. I believe that if we can do that basic work, and hospitality, I think hospitality is such a wonderful virtue, because you don't necessarily have to know someone or love them or even like them to extend hospitality. What I do know is that if we can start to see each other as human beings, meet each other as human beings, there will be possibility for a relationship that we absolutely will not be able to see or fathom in the absence of that kind of invitation and intention.
Could you then tell us something about your you obviously believe in evolution. I'm not just talking about Darwin, but spiritual evolution.
Yes, I do.
Could you tell us something about then your spiritual evolution, your spiritual journey, and at least take us through Berlin on the way, so that we could come back to a sort of what you've learned from that journey. You've had an incredible journey. What you've learned coming back into the 21st century, into this culture.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, which was, it was a very small world. And very flukishly ended up going to Brown University, which I had hardly heard of, and nobody I knew had heard of, and no one was impressed. And it was like going to another planet. It was like the world opening up. But I had grown up in an immersive religious world, Southern Baptist, and you and I were speaking beforehand. The Southern Baptist, this is the largest Protestant denomination in the country, and it was kind of the only game in town.
And your grandfather's a minister?
My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher, an evangelist, and a completely contradictory character, larger than life. And I think the contradictions in him very much formed my sense of theology and of the messiness of this enterprise. And my grandfather, his religion was, on the surface, it was so much about rules. It was all about things you shouldn't do. Everything was a slippery slope. Everything was a slippery slope on the way to having sex. It wasn't just that you couldn't have sex, theoretically. You also couldn't dance, and you couldn't drink, and you couldn't wear shorts, because all of these things might lead to temptation. The world was a perilous place, and the body was an entry point of danger.
So body is very important in your book.
Yes,
too.
But also what I see in my grandfather now, and what I think I perceived at the time without being able to articulate it, is that my grandfather was a very passionate person, and I think he was in touch with his passion and his lustiness, and so these rules were as much for him as for anyone else, and he knew he needed them, and he would impose them on the rest of us. My grandfather had a second-grade education, and I think he had a really big mind, and but he had never been invited to apply that mind to his Bible. And I think he was terrified of his questions. And and he was, he was stern, and yet very playful, and loving, and funny. And I think, on the one hand, my sense of God that I imbibed from him was judgmental and narrow-minded. I mean, Methodists weren't going to heaven. They're like,
well, we know that.
Not to mention everybody else.
It's Presbyterians.
But he was truly loving, and all of that was in my sense of, this universe we inhabit, and what might be behind it, what it is infused with.
Mm. So it didn't make you anti-religious, particularly?
No, it didn't. I would say that the minute I left home, I stopped. I never felt anti-religious. I stopped having much sense of how relevant this would be to the world I had entered.
Yeah. So you then go to this wicked university.
Yeah.
And what happens to you?
My mind opened up, and I studied history, and I learned German, and I got really interested in politics, and I got really interested in the Cold War, which, when I look back now, that was really a geopolitical conflict that it was very easy to transpose. I could transpose the religious perspective of my childhood to, the good and evil on a geopolitical scale. And I ended up in Berlin eventually, which was the fault line of that divide.
And you make an interesting comment about East Berlin and West Berlin, and how the people in the East would have something that the people in the West didn't have. Could you expand on that in terms of the fact that the West, in the West there was affluence and there was economic security, but in the East they had to have other things that held them together? And that was quite a profound effect on you.
Yes, so my last year in Berlin, I was the chief aide to our ambassador to West Germany, and he was a nuclear arms expert, and I was literally sitting around with people who were moving these maps around missiles around on a map of Europe. I was in a class at Stanford yesterday, and I realized these undergraduates, they can't imagine that, at that time there were 6,000 missiles in West Germany. Things feel bad now. They've been bad before. So I was working at this level of high power and high level policymaking. And then I was living in this city that really introduced me to kind of these questions I now follow about the human condition. Divided Berlin was kind of a laboratory, because you had one people, one history, one language, one culture, split down the middle into two opposing economic, political, ideological systems. And to be crass, one side was rich and one side was poor. I was always drawn. I had friends on both sides. I had people I loved on both sides. But I saw people in East Berlin who had, they had nothing, the way we would say that, materially, and also in terms of choice. They had a poverty of choice, of really agency to create their lives, which is so foreign to an American. But they did, right? I saw people who, working with nothing, created lives of beauty and dignity and intimacy. And so I started to question, I was in these rooms professionally where people officially were shaping the world and shaping destiny. But it wasn't that simple. And I started to wonder, at what level did I want to be working in what I ended up doing.
Well, this is the thing that struck me when you said that it was possible to have freedom and plenty in the West and craft an empty life.
Yeah.
And it was possible to have nothing in the East and create a life of intimacy, dignity, and beauty. And that was in the context of, you wrote about our infantilizing politics and our political language gone feral. And that comes back to the absence of a conversation in our culture about how we're going to be together, how we're going to look after each other. I've been thinking, reading your book, I thought, well, it comes out there are two doctrines. One is that everybody matters, that the conversation matters, and the other is we're in this together.
Yeah.
And the rest are footnotes to this, how we're going to build a world where actually human flourishing is a possibility. So what did you, after you left Berlin, what sort of person are you becoming right now? I mean, in this sort of stage of your life?
Well, you know, at that point I was a highly educated, sophisticated person, is how I saw myself, compared to my childhood self. So I was very suspicious and kind of unsettled that I was asking these questions about how do you create a worthy life? Like what, you know, where really does power reside?
A worthy life,
and
you said.
yes, and also this, you know, something I saw in Berlin up close that was kind of shattering to me, and I didn't know what to do with it. And this was part of my turn to theology, was people who had very large, extravagantly developed external lives and external power and accomplishment, and absolutely tiny, kind of adolescent inner lives. And you know, I think the 20th century cultivated that, right? Interior life was optional if you got around to it. I actually have felt these last couple of years through the last election that what we have now in our political life is that on steroids. It's almost like a caricature. What I'm also really aware of is that there's a beautiful generational chasm around this, right? I mean, that we are coming to the end of something that is not sustainable and is not attractive and is not good for us. But at the level at which we're living, we're challenging that, right? This idea of joining inner life with outer life, of asking questions of what matters and what has meaning, and not just who we want to be, but who we want to be for others, and understanding that as basic human work. We are cultivating that all around.
Yeah, it was an old definition of spirituality as the art of making connections, of seeing how everything is connected and how we live into that.
Yeah.
But I wonder, you find, for example, tolerance, too small a word for
Yes.
what we're doing. I'd like you to explain that a little bit. Where in some sense, there's a contrast in what you write about, because you have that gentle spirit in some ways, and yet you're asking us actually to be much more confrontative and more out there in what we are doing and how we're behaving. So there's a kind of, I like that, a kind of contradictory quality in what you're saying, that you want a gentleness, listening. Listening is so important, and at the same time, a toughness.
Yeah, I think tenderness and power and tenderness and passion and fierceness don't have to, can coexist and work in synergy. I think we need to be choosing where we're fierce. Yeah, I think tolerance was kind of a baby step it was kind of a baby step to pluralism. Again, it's hard to remember how, Vincent Harding was this great, wonderful civil rights leader who, I don't know, maybe some of you heard the podcast I did with him. He wrote King's Vietnam speech. He helped create the philosophy of nonviolence. And, he says, when it comes to being a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, what are the other multis? Society, we are, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. We are a developing nation. We've only been at this for about 50 years. And in fact, that is a short amount of time. We're in the midst of a long-term project. And in the 60s, when it was revolutionary for Catholics and Protestants to be talking to each other, for example, it was revolutionary to elect a Catholic president. And that was just that was the religious thing. And when you think about what was going on racially and how the Immigration Act of 1965, how, we opened ourselves to difference, even difference of ideas at a level that was completely new. And I think tolerance was a way to it was a civic virtue to put out there and to keep all of this safe, to navigate it. It's not, tolerance in the medical lexicon is about the limits of thriving in an unfavorable environment. Tolerance is about allowing each other to be who we are, to indulging and enduring difference. And we compartmentalized, we bracketed out a lot of our depth and our difference from common spaces. And celebrating diversity often was about naming the common ground, right? Oh, this we have in common. And actually ignoring a lot of the deep things that are different that make us so interesting and that are more perilous to traverse. But necessary to traverse if we are to know each other.
I mentioned in our conversation before coming on stage about the great Houston Smith. When he was a student, I think at Ithaca, he was designated to drive Aldous Huxley back to the airport.
Yeah.
And this young man, as he was then, had the cheek to ask Huxley, "Do you have any regrets?" And he said, "Yes, I wish I'd been more kind." And that's a word, I think, that we need to recover with its strength of what it is to treat each other as kin and to be kind to each other, to understand that common humanity. And I see a lot of that in your book is a kind of plea towards that robust vision of kindness.
Yes, and kind of what you were saying about tenderness and fierceness. I mean, to understand, I have trouble with the word kindness too, and it's been on too many bumper stickers and all that, but it can sound really wimpy. And but being on the receiving end of an act of kindness can make your day, right? We walk around with the power, also with the word. With word, we deal in words, and we don't realize how powerful that these things are. That at any given moment we have the power to make someone's day, to break someone's day. I mean, kindness is instant gratification on both sides.
We say sticks and stones may
block.
break my bones, but words or names will never hurt me. That simply is not true.
I remember when my daughter was, 8, 9. By the way, I write about wisdom, and I think that wisdom is accessible at every age. It's not just the province of age. In fact, we all grow old, but we don't all grow wise. And I think there's wisdom at many stages in life. There's wisdom of the 20s, there's wisdom of teenagers. And I remember when my daughter was, 8 or 9, and she came home one day and said, "Mom, you know that saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? That's not true."
Yeah, it isn't true. I was reading a review of a biography of Catherine Mansfield in New Zealand. Her parents have been away in England for 8 months, and she's, I think, 8 years old, with her brothers and sisters meeting the parents, on the boat, coming back to the boat. The first thing her mother says to her, getting off the boat and in front of everybody, is, "I see you're still fat."
Right.
And that lived with her. That whole notion that a word can make or break someone is very important to recover, I think. Some questions for you coming up, very good ones. Who would you like to interview? That is, perhaps someone who's no longer with us. Is there anyone?
Oh, from across time. Well, I'd really like to interview Einstein. However, I think he might be a terrible interview. So I'd want to try it if I could. And he became much more philosophical and spiritual in his own way. I mean, he wasn't traditionally religious anyway, but he talked about his cosmic religious sensibility, which I actually think must have been weirder in the mid-20th century. I think he kind of had a 21st century spiritual sensibility.
You do mention him in your book.
I mention him a lot. We did this show about him that just blew my mind and has always stayed with me. But he's a perfect example of the complex personality, brilliant. And actually, I think there's a spiritual genius about him. Terrible person to be married to. Not a great person to have as your father. But yeah, saints are also like that.
You mentioned it. Well, the definition of a saint is someone about whom there is insufficient information.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned in Einstein, you'd say that Einstein said that science was a razor blade in the hands of a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
And so that whole notion of knowledge and wisdom again comes into who you'd like to interview. And there's no complete... one of the things that struck me, which I resonate with, and I think those of you of a certain age in the audience will, because the older you get, the more you have to regret. And you can't undo the past, is this whole treadmill of perfectionism.
Yes.
And you mentioned perfection and perfectionism a lot in the book, and I wondered where that came from.
Well, we are fed this idea about being perfect, and of course none of us is perfect, but we also go to great elaborate lengths not to let that show. And even I do actually think we're on this learning curve of acknowledging this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so interesting that Brene Brown we're kind of rediscovering vulnerability.
Yes.
I mean, we're rediscovering something that's been true all along. I'm kind of intrigued, though. I mean, this is kind of the human condition, right? Even as we rediscover vulnerability, one way this is being applied now is there's this spate of business books about, failure is a part of life on the way to success. So that's the American thing we do.
Yes, it's just a pathway to success. Yes, right. Yes.
But the truth is, the crazy, strange, paradoxical truth about us as humans, and I don't know why it has to be this way, but it is this way, that it is primarily through the things that go wrong or don't go as planned, through loss, through surprise, that we learn and that we grow, that we have an opportunity to learn.
Opportunity to do that. I think the psychologically, when perfectionism doesn't work, we try ambition.
Yeah.
And when ambition doesn't work, the most hidden neurosis is resentment. And I think there's a lot of energy of resentment that comes out of a failed perfectionism.
There's, I think one of the wisest people I've ever interviewed is somebody named Jean Vanier. You probably know Jean Vanier.
Yeah.
Again, with this idea of tenderness and power, I'd say, and I write about this, Thich Nhat Hanh is somebody else who's like this. I would say the wisest people I've sat with, what the experience is of tenderness and power in an interplay. I mean, both of those things being true, and it's a very unfamiliar mix. Oh, I know what I was going to go with that. With Jean Vanier, it was, he's this very, he was from this famous family in Canada and a naval officer, this very distinguished. He became a philosopher, and then at some point he was in France and was captivated by an institution where men with Down syndrome, where people were put away in institutions then, kind of mid 20th century, and created something called L'Arche, where people were invited to live. People live in community with people with mental disabilities and all kinds of disabilities, and it is now happening all over the world. But And these are beautiful communities. But anyway, one thing he says is that one reason we get so fearful and anxious in front of disability is because people with physical disabilities are carrying their imperfections out on the surface. And we are trained frantically not to let our imperfections show.
Right.
And it's hard to carry that, and ultimately impossible.
There's a question here that is a leading question.
Okay.
What has been the most difficult perspective to process, and who was it from?
Oh gosh, I'm always bad about these kinds of questions about the one moment. I'm gonna have to pass on that. I can't single something out about that. I just interviewed Glenn Beck last week.
You did?
That's what came to mind. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
It hasn't been on the air yet. It'll be produced in May. I've had a conversation going with him. He is actually somebody who is claiming his part in the damaged place we're in as a society.
So he's changing and
well,
growing.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I really think we actually don't let people apologize.
No.
And we don't let people change as much as we want them to apologize and change. The minute, especially in politics, the minute somebody says they changed their mind, we excoriate them all over again for what they did wrong. So this is something I think that has to shift.
Someone said we live in a society where everything is permitted and nothing is forgiven.
Yeah. Which is so crazy, because if we actually want to grow up and mature, I mean, we know in our lives, anybody who had never changed and never admitted fault, I mean, you can live with that person, but we try to hold our public figures to this weird standard. The thing is, Glenn Beck is still Glenn Beck. He's a person of deep opinion and conviction, but he is changing, and he's very contradictory. But as we've been discussing, we all are. I think he kind of wears it more openly now. And so I'm walking around with that. I'm actually I have a lot of respect for him, and I also disagree with a lot of his opinions and perspectives, and all of that is true at the same time.
Can be true. I'm going to do a plug for our listeners. This is the Commonwealth Club of California program, and we're talking to Krista Tippett with her new book, Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery of the art of living, and I'm Alan Jones, your moderator. And you can listen to Commonwealth Club programs on the radio or podcast, watch our YouTube channel, check out our website, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I asked your permission on this beforehand, if you could say something then about the transition in terms of your divorce, because you've been through that as well. And I think of the Southern Baptist background, and then, you went to that terrible university, you did the... You did the work in Berlin. You had an amazing journey you've been on. And
there's one of my failures, right?
That was, and me too. But.
Yeah. Yeah, well, a lot of us are in that boat. A lot of us.
Yeah, I've tried perfection, but it didn't work.
I just wanted my husband to be more perfect, and he wouldn't play along.
Yeah, what is wrong with...
I don't know. That's kind of a joke and kind of not. One thing I think a lot about is this matter of love, and how, if such a thing as spiritual evolution is possible, which is an idea of Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, I didn't make that up. it is going to have something to do with us growing up love, which we've so watered down, turned into something you fall into and you fall out of. And actually, the show next week is with Helen Fisher, who's the chief scientific advisor of Match.com. And so the truth is, all these things happen in our brains that kind of make us do it. That falling in love is a form of temporary insanity, literally. So I think we actually, I think we haven't invested in, this matter of long-term love. I do think we're learning. And I also would like us to take love out of this merely private sphere, to think harder. Because this is something that happened to me after my divorce, is walking around for a long time saying, so many things in my life are wonderful. I just don't have love in my life. And then kind of one day waking up and saying, what a ridiculous thought. I have so much love in my life. There's so many forms of love. And those count too. Because we kind of overweight this one form of love, the one that makes us crazy, I don't think we appreciate, and I think love, I'm very invested now in this idea of love as a public good. And, we have made this move culturally of seeing hate, right? We have created legal categories to name these dark places where we reach the limits of tolerance and the human condition at its worst rushes in. And I think that actually gives us permission, sophisticated and educated as we are, to claim a place for love as perhaps the only, love as something very practical, as the only thing big enough.
I'm getting excited
to
because
meet that.
I was shocked when I was trained in a monastic tradition for priesthood, and the monks shocked us by saying love is a matter of policy. And if you get the emotion on top of it, you're lucky. But it's a policy about how you are in the world and how you treat people.
Yeah.
And I've come to see, at the time I was totally, romantic love was but that whole notion of being able to reverence the otherness of others, that realizing their sovereignty and their freedom as separate beings, and they're not just a project of the ego or a project of your feelings.
Yeah.
And there's something very liberating about that kind of loving.
Right, and love in theology and in philosophy and in practice is, very often not about how you feel in the moment.
Parents don't feed their children when they feel like it.
Yeah, right.
At least I hope not.
And at any given moment, we may be feeling all kinds of things about our children, right?
Yeah.
Here's something that I'm thinking so much about now. As we went through last year, 2016, it was just so clear to me that whoever won in November, the work ahead is to kind of reweave something called common life and figure out what that can mean in the 21st century. And actually, we all possess a lot of intelligence in our lives of love, in our private lives, that could translate very beautifully into the public sphere. For example, this, right? In our spheres of intimacy, our children, our families, our extended families, our coworkers, our friends, old and new, there's a whole range there of people with whom we have so much in common and we are soulmates, and people who drive us crazy a lot of the time. And people we stay in relationship by deciding what we won't talk about with them. And that also is a form of love. There's nothing romantic actually about it.
No. There's a lot of questions then around this, and very good questions having to do with education in the broad sense about what would your advice be for a young adult striving to fix our polarized society? I mean, what kind of difference would we have in our schools? The old European vision of education was for the formation of character,
Yeah.
not for the imparting of information or even skills. So have you any thoughts about our educational system and what we're teaching our children? And
Oh gosh, it's such a mess, isn't it? I mean,
how are your children doing?
my children are doing fine, but I think we inhabit this really interesting moment where, and this is part of, I mean, to me, the political dynamics are kind of are symptoms of the human drama that's going on. And part of our drama is that in a very short period of time, most of our major institutions have kind of stopped making sense. You know, I mean, of course, there are so many variations on school and there are beautiful innovations happening everywhere. But, you know, the way we thought school worked, the way we thought hospitals worked, the way we thought prisons worked, the way we thought politics worked, they don't make sense anymore. And they're kind of, so, and that's very stressful. It really is stressful. And I don't think that I don't want to say this. I was going to say, I'm going to take it back, but I was going to say that I don't think all of the best creativity and the incubation of new realities will come inside the institutions we have now. We're really remaking these forms. And I know some people are doing that inside the institutions too. But I want to say to this, you know, young person, you know, we also do have this agency to create those, what you do with your desire, whatever action you take in your world, in the world you can see and touch, that is part of the work of us creating these new forms and seeding this new vision and experimenting and incubating what will come next. But I think we're in this in-between period where we know very clearly what's broken, and we haven't come up with the new forms yet.
Yeah. I mean, what worries me is that what we communicate to people is a kind of false promise that you can be anything you want to be.
Right.
And I, you know, feel called to be a ballet dancer, and no one is taking me seriously.
Yeah.
You know, the notion that obviously within the mystery of human beings, there's an enormous amount of choice and possibility. But that notion you can be anything you want to be, and then people are frustrated and disappointed. And
well, that's also this emphasis that I think this is this 20th century emphasis on, you know, what you will be, which meant what job title you will have and how much money you will make and what your business card will say. I'm all for resurrecting the language of vocation.
yes.
And I think we collapsed vocation to job title. And vocation is asking the question of what, you know, not necessarily just what will you do, but who will you be? What kind of person will you be? And I think at different stages in life, you know, for many of us, there's a point where our primary vocation, our most passionate vocation is as a parent or as a partner or as a caregiver. I think it shifts in the course of life. And also this thing we have about meaningful work. And I realize that I say this from a very privileged position as somebody who's created, you know, work that is overtly meaningful. Although I always say to people who romanticize my job, that like having the beautiful conversation is kind of 5% of what I do, right? And I have to raise money, and I have, office politics, and the truth is that, I mean, I think this is getting to your point. And this may be becoming more true. The job itself may not be where the meaning is to be found. it may be how you are present to your coworkers. I mean, that also
That may be
matters.
the
This
vocation.
power to make someone's day, to be a generative part of a culture, or you may find your meaning, not inside that thing you're being paid for. It's also meaningful work to be working hard to pay to support your family.
Yeah. Do you think the culture suffers then from disappointed spiritual entitlements? That we have a right to be happy, and there's got to be someone's fault that we're not. Someone is messing around with my life.
Yeah. Well, but also, how have we defined spiritual entitlement? We confuse spiritual well-being with material well-being, with external measures.
Yeah. I think that whole notion, though, that I have a right to be happy.
Yeah. What did we do with that? Yeah.
What do we do with that?
Yeah.
And then make someone else responsible
Yeah.
for that. And then that makes our political conversation. I mean, I hesitate to read this question, but I'm going to anyway.
I can't wait.
Is if you could have a conversation with the president, what might you say to him? Easy question.
Well, actually, I do not interview sitting politicians, which also means I don't interview many religious leaders, because religious leaders are also sitting politicians. Because, and I think we all need to take some ownership for this, our leaders and politicians are not going. They are the president, and like any politician. They are not going to be revelatory and searching and open and vulnerable, and those are qualities of a good conversation. So I wouldn't set myself up for something that would fail. And I don't actually think our current president is a very good listener. I mean, I don't think he'd be a great conversation partner.
But you would interview.
And I don't think, so.
You would interview Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, since they're not in power.
I would. I mean, I think Barack Obama's way of, Barack Obama was always absolutely in control of every conversation he had.
Yes.
I mean, when he gave a media interview, even when he sat in Mark Maron's garage, so I would actually not have wanted to interview him either when he was president. I do think it would be wonderful to interview him at some point when he's gotten some rest. That's what I really want him to be doing now, is sleeping.
Right. You reminded me earlier in terms of the issue of perfectionism, the great lines of Leonard Cohen, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering.
Yeah.
There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Yes.
And one of the ways I thought, having read and enjoyed your book, is actually it is a celebration of those creative and important cracks where the light actually can get in beyond our sort of frenetic trying to control reality all the time.
Yeah.
And I wondered, one of the things, and it may be because of my background and profession, one of the things that drives me crazy are people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Right.
And I try not to be rude back and say, oh, you're a spiritual parasite. What do you say to, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual?
Well,
You're
in the-
kinder than I am, I
in
must
the
say.
in the period in which I've been doing this project, I feel like that language of religious not spiritual has now become this cultural trope.
Right.
And I actually think it's like the tip of an iceberg that has already moved on.
Right.
And I do think, the New Age, there was a lot of, I like to use the term spiritual promiscuity.
Yes,
There's,
right.
the kind of superficial, I'm so uninterested in that. But I think there's a maturing of the spiritual search, even at the same time that people are not necessarily associated with institutions the way they once were. I actually am kind of intrigued by this new phenomenon of people who tell me that they are religious but not spiritual.
Ah, I haven't
Yeah,
heard that one.
yeah, that's the
What do
cutting
they
edge.
mean by that?
You heard it here.
Wow.
Well, it's different kinds of people. So it's everything from a Unitarian Universalist minister to physicists, right? People who say they're not that interested in, I think spirituality is also a problematic word,
Yeah.
but they're not interested in that fluffy connotation of spirituality. That all they care about is what is embodied and how people are living,
Yeah.
how they are enacting these beliefs on the one hand. Or say, the physicists who said this to me, it's more, that they value what religion has carried forward in time. Ritual, community, community and text and teaching around questions of meaning. These are the institutions that have done this, and they have not always done that successfully. But it's the embodied, it's action, and we kind of have made religion, and journalism has certainly done this. It's about what you believe. That is such a
nothing.
thin
I know,
veneer of any interesting, deep spiritual journey or
So
life
true,
of faith.
yeah. I agree with you completely. You remind me of a great conversation years ago with an old Orthodox rabbi, wonderful man who'd obviously seen what Hitler had done, and his first definition of orthodoxy was, if you were in charge, would I be safe? If you were in charge, would there be room for me? And that's that sort of making room for others, which is part of what you're talking about hospitality, about generosity of spirit, about being able to be in true conversation, which enables that new reality to emerge, I think. And it's interesting to me is that the doorways into this are all over the map. I think cosmology, astrophysics is reintroducing us to mystery. E.M. Forster rudely said, "Poor little talkative Christianity."
Right.
Was yapping and having answers to everything instead of opening people up to mystery and to questions.
Yeah.
And the sense of
Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this passage about listening and life together. He says, that Christians prattle on.
Yes.
And the man who is no longer listening to his neighbor will also not be able to listen to God.
That's right. So, what's the next thing?
Well,
these people need to know.
We have something called the Civil Conversations Project.
Tell us about that.
It's just, I think what I'm interested in, what I care about, and what I see really alive in the world, inside institutions, outside institutions, is this desire and commitment to join inner life with outer presence in the world. And the interplay between the inner and the outer. And my definition of wisdom is it can be connected to intelligence and knowledge and accomplishment, certainly. But I think the measure of wisdom is the imprint a life has made on other lives. I think if any of us think about the wisest people in our lives, that's what we will be aware of, how they affected others. Also, if we think of the wisest people we've known, they'll probably, in our mind's eye, have a smile on their face. So this is not about eating your spinach, although spinach is cool now, but you know what I mean. So I'm fascinated by how this idea that I started out with, that we need to be able to talk about this part of life in public, that it's critical to also how we live together and how we recreate public life and recreate common life.
What comes across in your book is what I'd call a generous humility. Now, humility can sound sort of being, but it's a humility which is based or fed by radical amazement.
Yes.
I would see in your book amazement at what I call the otherness of others, of being prepared to listen. It would be a kind of generous humility.
Yeah, this is something else I learned from my children when they were young. You know, there's this idea of the humility of the child in the New Testament, which is supposed to be so worthy, and I always found that just, you know, and I think as a woman, I associate humility with ineffectuality. I watch, you know, the humility of a child is not about debasing yourself or doubting yourself even, but it is about walking through the world absolutely ready to be amazed.
Right.
And discovering everything new, and you know, genuinely being curious about what might be in that discovery.
Actually, it reminds me, I forget them all as 5, wisdoms about. One of them is life isn't about you.
Yeah.
And that might sound very gloomy, but that is such a relief.
Yes, yes.
And to understand that, and I do commend this remarkable book to you. I want to thank you for an amazing conversation, and this is, we've reached the point in the program when we have to say, that's it.
Thank you so much.
However, you might have one parting word of wisdom, not to put you on the spot.
Well, just following on what you just said, you know, I'm not interested actually in anything that is merely spiritual. I think spiritual life that is meaningful and that can redeem us, whatever that means, is absolutely reality-based. In fact, more reality-based than a lot of the cultural and economic assumptions that we've kind of taken in, that tell us that we can be all powerful and perfect, and that we don't have to really take in the fullness of our humanity or the humanity of others.
Yes, it's a great way to conclude. I want to thank you. Our thanks to Krista Tippett for coming to talk about her life and her new book, Becoming Wise, An Inquiry into the Mystery of the Art of Living. Now, for our audience members who'd like their copies of Becoming Wise to be signed by Krista, we ask that you stay seated after the program and wait for further instructions from a Commonwealth Club staff member. I'm Alan Jones, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.